Welcome to this episode of Chatting with Staxx. I'm your host, Bill Staxx, and today I got Mooch. Would it be like you would go to a bar and fight these guys, or would they just you catch
It
them
wa
in
Yeah,
public?
it's hard to say. It wasn't really planned, and if you follow the stuff on the media and stuff, a lot of times it happens at public events, unfortunately. Which I have strong beliefs about that and opinions, and don't think it should go that way. But normally it just happens because they run into each other. So the Vagos are at one bar, and at the time when the Angels didn't get along with them, and they'd find out, or they were happened to be there or riding by and see their bikes, or you'd see a guy ride by in the patch. I mean, they're both clubs are highly visible. They're both wearing their patches all the time. So I think it was more chance most of the time, um, than people would believe. A lot of it wasn't like super organized violence. It was just, people would run into each other and then egos would get the best of it.
Yeah. So then, how long until you patch over? And what was that like? What was the approach like for you to even join the Mongols? How did you get introduced to them? And
Yeah, when I moved to Nevada so when I first moved to Nevada before I was a Vago or anything, I had met a Mongol, Coconut Dan, who looking back turned out to be a confidential informant and helped start all of Operation Black Rain. But I didn't really spend any time with him. I just would see him around town, and it was my first. I'd never seen a Mongol before. I'd read about him and I knew, I'd heard of him, but I'd never seen one. And the chapter in my area was not very big, and all due respect to them, they weren't the type of people I usually would have hung out with. So I didn't really have a lot of interest in them at the time. But they were growing nationally. I mean, like we were talking about time and place, and this was a time when Doc Cavazos had taken over, and he was going on a really heavy recruitment drive, and the Mongols were expanding all over the country. And they had a website, and every few months it would welcome this state and welcome that state, and they were all growing pretty quickly. And they had they started to have a really solid reputation, and they're in the media a lot. And they kind of became a pretty big name. Not that they weren't before, but they were getting a lot more popular during that time. At the same time, I was having issues with the Vagos. I was a young kid. I joined something that I don't think I really knew what I was joining. I liked, I drove into motorcycles because I love motorcycles. And so when I found, younger guys that had shared experiences and into punk rock, I didn't think about politics or national levels or how these things work, and so I jumped in, and I really liked the guys in my area. And I met a lot of guys I liked, but I didn't like the political aspect. And at the time, Terry the Tramp was the national president of the Vagos, and was doing some things that a lot of people didn't agree with. And there was a time where the Vagos were fighting Vagos, and we were in that South Valley chapter, and the North Valley chapter had some issues with us. And it got to a point where another member had been killed down in California. And, I started questioning why I was doing, I came in this club for brotherhood and to ride motorcycles. I'm not making money. This wasn't a criminal organization. So why would I want to be worried around my own brothers for my own safety? So I started really thinking about this might not be for me. And, I'd known some Mongols by then, and I knew the Mongols had a rule that Mongols aren't allowed to fight each other. There's nothing that two brothers can't sit down and discuss or talk out, right? That's what real brotherhood should be. So that really intrigued me, and it really kind of attracted to me that. And so I reached out. They had posted on their website that they were welcoming Mongols to Oregon, which turned out was some hoax. I mean, I think there was one guy trying to come around, and they were just trying to flex that they were growing. But someone from their national leadership reached out and called me and invited me to a meeting. And so I sat down with the Vagos in my chapter, and we were all pretty disgruntled. We'd already been talking a lot. We'd gone down to the Vagos Nationals and tried to sit down with some of the national leadership and, voice our concerns and what we were upset about. We weren't feeling heard. And initially our whole chapter wanted to leave. And so I said, well, hey, I'm going to go to this meeting. Potentially we could do this. And so I flew out to Florida, and I had this meeting with the Mongols. I was out there while they were having a meeting with the Outlaws, which was the first time I actually physically seen any Outlaws. Talk about that quite a bit in my book too, that experience. But we went through some stuff out there, and I was invited to join. And so when I moved home, I started the first chapter of the Mongols in Oregon.
so when you went out there, you had your patch on when you went to
Yeah, I was
meeting?
wearing a T-shirt that said Vagos on it. I had my soft patch. The Vagos have a rule: you can't wear your patch anywhere unless you ride your bike there, which I always respected and appreciated. But because I flew there, I could only wear a T-shirt that said Vagos on it, but I couldn't wear my actual patch.
How many people did you go there with?
I went there by myself.
What? By yourself?
Yeah, well, looking back, it wasn't the smartest move, man. I didn't even know any Mongols. I flew out there. Some Mongols picked me up from the airport, took me to an Airbnb. Oh, it was back then. It was a condo. It was before Airbnb existed, but same concept. And just stayed with a bunch of strangers and went everywhere they went. And I spent 4 days with them, and went to some meetings with them, and just really got to know each other.
There was no uneasy feeling when you were there or anything like that?
No, not really. I mean, I guess there was potential where there could have been, but no, it was. I mean, I guess if I went out there and maybe was really disrespectful or didn't, I don't know. I think it was pretty safe. I was pretty naive in the fact that I was excited about it anyways. But I clicked with the guys right away. I knew it was a good fit. I knew as soon as I got there, this is where I was supposed to be. This was the family I wanted to be a part of, and it clicked right away.
So now when you fly back, what's the process of telling them? Can you walk me through what that day was like?
Yeah, it's kind of sketchy, right? So, I want to tell my our chapter's already discussing it a little bit. So the first thing is we have a meeting and the whole chapter wants to know what's going on. And the reason I say it's sketchy is because everyone says they're on board, but you don't know who's running off telling so-and-so, or, and so you don't know what your safety is around a group of guys that may or may not really be doing this with you. Right. And you can imagine it's a pretty disrespectful move to leave one club for another, and things could potentially get violent or pretty dangerous for doing that. So we went back, sat down, had this meeting. At the time, the whole chapter said they were on board. But I think what happened is, there were certain guys that realized this might be their chance for leadership or their chance to progress in the club they were in, even though they said they were unhappy. And it kind of turned into some backstabbing and things going on behind the back. And so we agreed to have another meeting, follow up. And I could kind of tell in between that meantime, things were getting sketchy. People weren't being, you know what I mean? You could just tell. So half of us chose to leave, and we packed up all of our stuff and we gave it to the sergeant of arms that we were still friends with at the time, and respectfully turned over all club property, so there was no issue there. And any dues or any, we tried to make it as amicable as possible.
So you lay your patch down, or do you bring it to a table? Like what do you do? Put it in a box and send it to them?
Nah, I mean, we handed it all over in person. We just scheduled a meeting to meet up, and we had I had duffel bags full of t-shirts and jewelry and patch, and just handed it over, and they go through and make sure everything's there. And at the time, we shook hands and said, best of luck, and moved on. But things escalated pretty quick after that for a little bit. But I get it. Part of it, like I said, was pretty disrespectful on our end. I understand, there's rules against that stuff. In this day and age, I don't think the Vagos are a club you can leave and join the Mongols. They have agreements. Those two clubs have agreements that you can't do that. Like I said, it was a time and a place, right? It was a time that Doc was really expanding and was allowing guys from other clubs. A lot of times you can't go from one major club to another major club. At the time, with all due respect to the Vagos, at the time the Vagos weren't as big as they were now. They didn't claim to be a 1%er club back then. So there were some things that worked in my favor, timing wise.
Yeah.
But yeah, we just handed everything over, and then then the rumor mill started going and the shit talking started happening. And then I talked about this in my book too, but a federal agent came to my house and said that, that the Vagos had a hit out on me and my brother. And, they were at a duty to warn or some stuff, some stupid shit like that. So things escalated, but thankfully never got too serious. There was a couple little skirmishes, but nobody got hurt. And, time went by and things, time passes. And thankfully I rebuilt a lot of relationships with a lot of those guys, but it took a lot of time. That's for sure. I mean, this was 2006 when this was happened, 2007 when this happened. So
almost 20 years ago.
Yeah. I joined the Mongols of November of 2007.
So after you give them all the property back, what was the process? Did you go back home? Did you go and meet them and get your new patch?
No, I went back home. There was kind of a little lag time. And then I went down to the group of us went down to Reno. And at the time, the Mongols were doing somewhere you kind of had to interview. I mean, interviews are kind of a silly term, but you sat there and talked to some of the leadership guys, and it's kind of the final step to make sure if they want you in the club or not. And so I had to sit down with some intimidating guys that had big reputations and answer a bunch of questions and spend the evening with them. And then they voted to decide if we can join or not. And they obviously voted that we could. And then the next day we were awarded our patches.
So what's it like when they hand you that patch?
It's pretty crazy, man. I mean, I'm at the time I was 26 years old. And I'd always heard of the Mongols, once I started getting into bikers, and they had this pretty crazy reputation. And, the Vagos, a lot of the ones I met and a lot of the other clubs are like hard party and hard riding clubs. And they have a lot of tough guys and they're tough clubs, and I don't take that away from them. But the Mongols had this reputation of all seriousness at the back, especially back then. It was like, it was all seriousness, and it seemed like it was like next level. So it was, it was intimidating, but it was also a rush. It was thrilling, but you put it on and instantly go, well, Hell's Angels are looking for me and cops are looking for me, but the brotherhood was next level. So, It was exciting, man. And honestly, it was really exciting.
Yeah, because they had to vote. Like, what was it like waiting for them to vote? You're like sitting there like, oh shit.
Right. Cause, if they voted no, and I already left the other club I was in, I guess that was it for club life for me. Right. That would have been the end of the road. So,
Yeah. So they end up giving it to you. What was your next step? What did you do from there? You were in Reno when you met them, right?
yeah.
And
So the
then,
group of us went back to Oregon. Now we had our patches. There was
how
two
many
guys.
of you?
There
How
was
many?
four that went on the trip, and then two that we came back to. So we started the chapter with 6. Now there was no Mongols in Oregon. The nearest chapter was like San Jose. So there was no chapters even near us. And again, not something that Mongols would probably do today, or most clubs. We wouldn't start that far away. And we knew damn well that all these clubs that we grew up respecting and looking up to weren't going to want us there. So, like when we were Vagos, we spent a lot of time with the Free Souls, and they were based out of Eugene. And at the time, that's where we were going to start this first Mongol chapter. So the very first thing we did when we got home, is I called the president of the Free Souls and asked for a sit down. And I think it pretty much took him by surprise, because I don't think anyone really knew what we were up to.
Walk me through that situation when you go there to meet.
Yeah, I mean, security was tight on my end, right? Because I didn't know how it was going to go, and I knew they weren't going to be happy. And it was a tough situation for me as well, because I knew this was going to be a disrespectful move. I knew this was going to upset these guys, and I completely understood why. But on the flip, I couldn't ask their permission. I wasn't going to let them tell me no. So I had to be stern in the fact of, hey, we're here now.
You're basically going to tell them. You're not going to ask them,
we
right?
didn't ask. And we did that with all the clubs eventually in Oregon. We sat down with all of them, and essentially what we would tell them is, hey, we're here. We're not going anywhere. We'd love to coexist. We could, we could ignore each other for all we care. And especially as I grew in the club world, and kind of because I ended up expanding the club all over the Midwest and into some other countries and into Australia. And a lot of what I tell these other clubs is, with all due respect, we kind of come from a different, the type of people that join Mongols might not be the same type that join these other clubs. So there's not an overlap. So we usually don't go to the same type of bars. We're not recruiting the same type of people. We're not really stepping on each other's toes. And so a lot of times there'd be agreements like we wouldn't take any of their ex-members or ex-hangarounds, those types of things out of respect. But the initial conversation was just, hey, we're here and we could coexist, or I guess we'll have to do what we have to do and see how it goes.
Were any of them really pissed off about it?
Yeah, every one of them. Yeah. There was a big article in the Oregonian newspaper a few months after we started that was talking about this impending biker war. And there was the Free Souls were having a big anniversary party in Eugene. And I wanted to make a statement and a present. So I decided that we'd all get together, all 8 of us at this point, right? Like, I think there was over 100 of the other guys. It was all the other clubs together. It was all 8 of us. And we wanted to show we weren't scared. So we just rode around all day in our patches, going to the bars that they hang out at and frequent at. And it started the pot, right? It essentially threw the rock at the bee's nest on that one. And some feds had pulled over a car that had the local presidents of all the major clubs, and they had a trunk full of guns and had said, the word on the street was they were looking for us. Now, thankfully, that didn't play out like that, and it didn't happen. But that describes the situation early on. That's how tense it was.
Wow. I can't even imagine, man. You're like basically a sitting duck or a riding duck, right?
And within a year and a half, 2 years, I went from